Welcome to Parenting Successful Teens, the podcast that cuts through the overwhelm and stress of this phase and offers parents simple, practical, cognitive, science-based strategies for keeping their teens on track. Join Master Coach and real-life mom, Allie Irwin, to talk about real teens, real problems, and the skills it takes to raise successful adults.
Hello, everybody. This week, my business coach sent me an email asking for my metrics. And I wasn't really clear what she meant, so I just wrote back, which metrics did she want? Year-to-date sales? Did she want expenses? Which metrics did she want? And her answer was brilliant. I got one sentence back, and it said, "Send me the metrics that matter." I got to thinking, that is such a great question for you all to answer as well. What metrics matter to you? Not to your mother or your neighbors or, college admissions boards. What metrics matter to you? Is it your child's GPA? Is it the number of APs they took? Is it how many sports they played? Is it the number of eye rolls you get when you ask them to unload the dishwasher? Or heavy sighs when you ask them basically anything? Is it the number of times you have to ask them to do something? Is it the number of dinners you eat together? Is it the number of times that you worry in a day or the number of minutes you spend worrying? Is it the number of red flags you spot? Or the number of good conversations you have? And how do you even define what is a good conversation and what isn't? What counts towards those metrics? Most people, when you ask them what they want for their kids, which is another version of the question, what matters to you? Most people will say some version of, I just want my kids to be happy. And you can see if you were really trying to think of another person's happiness as your metric, how undefined that is. Are you talking about short-term happiness, like the kind of happiness that they have when you pick them up a Starbucks before you grab them at school? Or are you thinking long-term happiness? And are you thinking that their happiness comes from you helping them avoid unfair or cruddy things happening to them? Teachers, getting a bad teacher or getting a bad grade on a test. How do you help them not forget to fill out the question on the backside of the exam that they missed? Or an unkind comment or a misunderstood comment from a friend. When you start thinking about your happiness hinging on their happiness, you can see that's a minefield of opportunities for you to be unhappy. So I'm recommending that their happiness not be your metric. And if happiness isn't your metric, then how do you decide what metrics matter to you? It's really just another way of asking you what your priorities are as a mom. So I have 4 suggestions for you today on how to think about your metrics. And the first is that your metric be something that is under your control. Okay, that's the first problem I see with having someone else's happiness be your metric. Is you have no control over that. You have no control over how happy other people are. And so your metric should be something that you have control over. So a metric that matters to me is connection with my family. Being connected to my adult kids is something that matters to me a lot. And I think that I can control that because I can control the ways that I reach out to them. The number of texts I send is reflective of how often I'm thinking of them. And I'm not telling you that I text my kids 100 times a day. That's not what I mean. But I'll hear something on a podcast and that will remind me of a conversation that we've had or something, that we've talked about. And I'll say, hey, I heard this on Ezra Klein today, and it made me think about this and this and this. Or what do you think about this idea? Okay. That is me having control over how I connect with them. Another example is we are getting ready to move, and so I've been packing tons of boxes, and I have perhaps an unholy amount of memorabilia in my house. I'm not much of a saver in many areas, but there is a lot of memorabilia in my house. And so my kids in the past couple of weeks have gotten a whole bunch of texts of their baby shoes and their Latin National Honor Society award certificates, with a funny little, I think they're funny little hey, still using that Latin kind of text to go with it. Another thing that I reach out for is family news saying hey, I'm visiting grandma next weekend. Maybe we can set up a time to call so that you can talk to her. So those are all just ways that it is under my control how connected I feel to my kids. Because whether they respond or not, while I'm reaching out in those ways, I'm feeling the connection. Okay, that's a really important distinction, is just the act of sending them that picture or sending them the text or calling them, whether they pick up or not, I am feeling connected to them in that moment. And so in that way, it's under my control. So brings me to the second point is my suggestion is they be things that you can control without getting attached to the outcome. Okay, so your efforts are under your control, but you are not attached to the outcome. I don't need my kids to respond to all of those texts. I don't need them to pick up the phone every time that I call. So there's no pressure. I can send those bits of connection out without any expectation of return from them. If I were hinging my good feelings on their response, then that's a terrible metric because, again, we want those metrics to be something that we can control. We don't want to put our happiness, our feelings of success and confidence as a mom on their actions. We don't want to be attached to their outcomes. Another great example, a metric that mattered to me when they were younger, is that they ate healthy food. Not to a crazy amount, but in general, I grew up on a farm. My mom had a giant garden. We had our own cattle. And so I grew up on really good farm fresh quality food. And it was important to my kids to give them that same kind of nutritional upbringing. So I have control over that, right? I have control over what I buy. I have control over what's in the house. I have control over what options I am willing to pay for and create for them. But I don't have any control over what they actually eat, right? Especially as we get into the teenage years. I'm laughing because my son literally used to keep a jar of frosting in his nightstand. Oh, which, I would occasionally find when I was putting stuff away and just leave it because he bought that. That's him exercising control over what he chooses to eat. And another way he wanted pizza way more often than I was willing to buy pizza for him. He has some food allergies, and so we had to get his own special large pizza, and it roughly doubled our pizza budget. If you have teenage boys, you know what I'm talking about. That was not happening more than once a week. But he wanted to eat what he wanted to eat, and so he got a job at a pizza parlor and eventually became the weekend manager of a pizza parlor so that he could eat what he wanted to eat. That's me exercising what matters to me and him exercising what matters to him. And in that way, that's what I think is so brilliant about the teenage years is you are you are developing their agency as separate from your own. Like you get to decide what you want, and they are getting to choose what they want to do, what they're willing to make happen for themselves. The third point is the metrics that matter to you will be your choices, and they'll be unique to your family, and other people might not approve. Okay, when you step away from the metrics that matter to society, and by society, I just mean the community you live in. You know, we've lived all over the United States, and the metrics that matter, you know, when we lived in New Jersey are slightly different than the metrics that mattered when I lived in Arizona and when I lived in Michigan. They're not radically different. We all want our kids to be healthy and happy and pursue things that matter to them. But some of the other metrics that were very important in the community we lived in New Jersey are so different that they're laughable. They would be laughable to be important here in Michigan. So I am laughing because I can't tell you the number of times that someone would come up to me when we lived in New Jersey and say some version of, "It's great that you let your son dye his hair blue. I could never do that. My son goes to private school and they wouldn't allow it." Or my mother-in-law would die if she saw that our son had dyed his hair blue. And you have to remember, my kids are older. My son is 24 now. And so 10 years ago, it was a much, much bigger deal to dye your hair than it is now. And an entire town looked like a Vineyard Vines ad or a J. Crew ad. Like, it was such an uber preppy, classic East Coast town that to have a kid show up to school with a mohawk or blue hair, like that was pretty radical. And a lot of people had things to say to me about what I was allowing in my house. And hair just wasn't that important to me. That was not, to me, a metric that mattered. And you listen in the responses I got, like to that mom that was telling me that, like her son having a very particular private school education. Not every school wouldn't have those rules, but she wanted her son to go to this very specific school that had very specific rules, and going to that school was the metric that mattered to her. Having her mother-in-law's approval, that was the metric that mattered to her. And it's fine that everyone is going to have different opinions than you do. Just be aware that when you're being criticized by someone else, what they're really telling you is they believe in different metrics. And so when you think about it through that lens, you think, oh, nothing's gone wrong here. Like, okay, they wouldn't let their kid do this, and I think it's fine. It's fine. They have different metrics that matter. Which brings us to the fourth point. And I almost feel a little teary with this one, because this one, honestly, is the biggest deal. Your metrics that matter are most likely going to be different than your kids' metrics that matter. This is honestly one of the toughest transitions that parents make, is realizing that their kids want different things. Maybe you'll have kids that don't want different things, but especially if you have multiple kids, chances are high that at least one of them is going to prioritize things that don't matter to you or are different than what matters to you. And if this is the case, I want you to give yourself so much grace, because that can be a real challenge. For example, I value safety. I am a tiny blonde female, and violence against women is a real thing. And then once I became a mom, it became really important to me. Like, I was responsible for the safety of these other humans. And so safety is a big deal to me. Like, I viewed it as part of my job to keep them emotionally safe, physically safe, psychologically safe. And I believe that it was my job to keep them safe until they were old enough to keep themselves safe. Okay, so herein lies the rub. My son does not value safety to the same extent that I did. And I do. And once he got old enough to start making some of his own choices, he made a lot of choices that scared me. And so as we were transitioning from being the mom in charge and he was growing into his adulthood, that's something that we had to navigate over and over and over. And I had to get comfortable and guide through so that I could be confident I was meeting my metric that mattered in a way that felt good to me while continuing to grow and stretch and allow him to take over, as he became an adult. He was in charge of his own safety. And really the biggest way that I transition that is, instead of thinking of me making the rules and keeping him safe, thinking of becoming a safety net and helping him navigate his own decisions. And his metric is more something like pursuing his goals. Like, he's willing to take a lot more risks to pursue his goals than I would be. His metric allowed him to move to Europe with what I would consider like a fairly loose plan of where he was going to live and how secure the job offer was that he moved on. Like, that is not something I could have done. But because I'm so aware of these metrics, I could see that his metric was different than mine. And I could navigate mine in a way that supported and honestly is pretty amazed by his. And that's really the benefit. That's why these are worth looking at. It's just another way of thinking about your priorities and thinking about your kids' priorities and how you can support yourself while you're supporting them. So that's what I would love for you to ponder this week. What are your metrics that matter, and how are you living those out? Hey, if you enjoyed today's show and you want even more support and a shot of fresh inspiration in your email box each week, you have to get on my list. Sign up to receive my free guide on how to stop second-guessing yourself as a mom. There are so many decisions to make as a mom, and this guide will help you to make decisions and just move on. No more waking up 3 a.m. wondering if you made the wrong decision. This guide is so good. Even my non-mom clients are raving about it. So sign up today, and I will see you next week.